Belfast in the dark of early morn. British soldiers came marauding, wrecking little homes in scorn. Heedless of the crying children, dragging fathers from their beds, beating sons while helpless mothers watched the blood pour from their head. Armored cars and tanks and guns came to take away our sons, but every man will stand behind the men behind the wires.
The violent nature of empire attempts to sever communities which they occupy. The playbook colonizers deploy during their occupation is identical across continents. In the past, occupying forces sought to atomize indigenous communities through the deliberate separation of families and forcing children into the colonial education system. This effort to forcibly assimilate future generations into docile subjects instead of active resistors comes from a colonial strategy to quell resistance in the crib. The kidnapping of children is a practice still utilized today, and it is to beat communities in the global south into submission. The song Men Behind the Wire describes the active Irish Republican resistance to British occupation. The song Men Behind the Wire was written in reaction to Operation Demetrius, which was British police going into homes of Irish and kidnapping men who they thought were associated with the Irish Republican movement. It's like this benevolent white savior, white man's burden, chauvinistic, paternalistic attitude that says, like, you can't take care of your own kids, we're gonna take them because it's best for the kids. That kind of colonial attitude is prevalent, like I said, from Palestine to West Papua, so I'm gonna go into some more specific examples. The case studies I'll be looking at are the British treatment of Irish children, the Israeli treatment of Palestinian children, the Americans' treatment of indigenous children, and the Indonesians' treatment of West Papuan children. As of December 2024, according to the Israeli Prison Service, there are over 9,619 Palestinians held captive by the Zionist entity. Are part of a release negotiation. I saw one article. It came out the first month of this year, and it said that about 300 children are currently in custody, and only 23 have been returned, and that's the 24th of January 2025. So there may have been more, but Israelis are making an effort to make mass arrests of children, specifically in the West Bank right now. More about the practice of kidnapping children from their parents in a hope to quell any possibility of resistance in future generations. In West Papua, the Indonesian suppression of the West Papuan indigenous communities divides families forcefully. In an article written in March of 2014 by the Free West Papua campaign, it details two children who escaped from boarding school in Jakarta. One of the students said, quote, "Sometimes they slap us in the face, beat us with a wooden stick. They just told us we're Papuans, we're black. We had black skin." Demanius Gobe is a West Papuan student who was forced to go to school in Jakarta, and he describes the ways that they tried to make him abandon his culture and take up Indonesian attitudes and culture, even from dress to his name that they changed while he was there because they want him to assimilate into majority Indonesian Muslim culture, not have him be Christian. But he said, quote, "told their real Papuan names were forbidden." Indonesia and other colonial powers hope to dilute indigenous communities by outlawing language and other cultural practices, and to strip them of their identity and connection to the land. Similar to the Indonesians' cultural genocide of the West Papuans, the English deployed near identical tactics on the Irish. The British established Protestant charter schools where Irish children were expected to abandon their traditional language and adopt English, forcibly assimilating them, like I said, into British culture. Students were commonly beaten in Ireland if they did not speak English. Irish and Black history are very intertwined. Maybe I'll do another video like more in depth on that. The IRA was like a pretty big ally to the Black Panther Party, and they both uphold theories of Marxism and believe in active resistance. Ireland, even as they struggled for independence, showed solidarity with other oppressed people, including Black slaves in America. This strong sense of solidarity between Black Americans and the Irish was even seen as early as 1862, where you had Irish mill workers in Lancashire refuse to process cotton that had been harvested by the hands of forced labor in America. So in 1845, Frederick Douglass traveled to Ireland where he met Daniel O'Connor. Daniel O'Connor was an Irish nationalist and a Republican, and the two struck up a conversation after O'Connell's speech, and he even introduced Douglass and had him address the crowd, and Douglass would become known as the Black O'Connell. So there's very strong ties of solidarity between the Black and Irish community. And then later in 1862, you have the workers at the Lancashire mill refuse to process cotton that had been harvested by slaves in America. And then later on you have, IRA, Black Panther Party. The colonial project in America brutally repressed and continues to Indigenous communities and First Nations. The residential schools that forcibly separated children from their parents exhibited explicitly paternalistic, chauvinistic attitudes. It was not uncommon for Indigenous children to be physically and sexually abused while at these residential schools. And in the US, for example, over 3,000 children died while in government care. 1,000 in Canada, probably much higher. We know how settlers like to cook the books on their atrocities.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
Unfortunately, many of the children who died while in residential schools were never returned to their families. Very similar to how Israel will not return the bodies of political prisoners if they still have time to serve on their sentence. The armed resistance in Palestine, led by Hamas, was able to secure the release of a good amount of political prisoners. The Palestinian political prisoners aren't terrorists or guilty of any other crime other than being Palestinian. Even active resistance isn't a crime. The colonial state will use your children against you. And time to time again, we see them deploying the same tactics, which are deliberately separating families and then using children as a way to coerce parents into assimilating and becoming a complacent subject of the crown.